are being circulated, but we want the maximum time for the presentations and questions and answers for the senators. So welcome to the committee. Mr. Rowswell, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup. C'est un honneur d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. C'est un moment historique pour le Venezuela, mais c'est aussi un moment historique pour la politique étrangère du Canada. In the face of a profound political crisis in Venezuela, Canada has called for the restoration of popular sovereignty in that country. In doing so, I believe that our government is articulating an approach to democracy promotion that is uniquely Canadian. From my observation, this approach is based on three fundamental principles. The first is that sovereignty rests ultimately not with governments, but with citizens of each country. The second is that the role of foreign governments, like Canada, is to follow local actors and not to lead them in a democratic movement. And third is that when we do choose to support local democracy movements, we do so with the countries of the region, so that it is a collective and multilateral approach. This approach has led the government of Canada to stand with the National Assembly, the last remaining democratically elected body representing Venezuelans, as that assembly laid out a path to putting citizens back in charge of their country. That legislature designated Juan Guaido as interim president while elections are organized, and Canada joined with most of Latin America in supporting that strategy. But 4 weeks later, this crisis grinds on. Canadians have begun to debate this approach, and I believe that's entirely appropriate, given the stakes for Venezuela, given the stakes for the hemisphere, and given the stakes for Canadian foreign policy. Popular sovereignty means that the people of Venezuela should determine their own fate. But how do we know what Venezuelans want? This is the contribution I would like to make to the debate this morning, because I believe it is possible for us as Canadians to listen to the people of Venezuela and to make a judgment about what they're telling us, even if it differs radically from what their autocratic ruler wants us to believe. I spent close to 4 years in Venezuela. As Canada's ambassador, I led a team of talented professionals whose job it was to listen to Venezuelans and to make sense of what we heard. So how did we, as Canadian diplomats, assess what Venezuelan citizens were telling us? Well, we had a variety of methods. Let me start with polls. It's not easy to run in a repressive country, but public opinion polls are still feasible in Venezuela, and we followed all of them. Our observation of the many polls that we followed was that by 2015, support for Maduro had dropped to between 15 and 25% and never rose beyond that, with opposition to Maduro consistently in the 60s, 70s, and sometimes even 80s. The most credible firm is Data-Analysis, and its most recent poll in November 2018 found that 63% of Venezuelans want Nicolas Maduro removed from office. Now, Venezuelans are also heavy users of social media. This presents another way for us to assess what most of them think. And if you analyze publicly available data from Twitter and Facebook, you can see that the majority of accounts supporting the government are being directed in a coordinated campaign, while as those supporting the National Assembly are dispersed and organic. But the principal method by which we listened to Venezuelans was using the oldest tool in the diplomatic handbook. We talked to hundreds and hundreds of them. Our embassy made a determined effort to engage Venezuelans of every walk of life, of every political opinion, of every socioeconomic class. We went out of our way to engage working class Venezuelans, since they are the hardest group traditionally for diplomats to engage with. We made an effort to visit as many barrios, shanty towns, as possible, because we wanted to make sure that we understood how the poor and how the marginalized thought, and not just the privileged. Now, when I first arrived in 2014, we found a country that was still polarized between Chavistas and those opposing the Chavista legacy, now led by Maduro. But those divisions faded as the economic crisis deepened, as residents of these poor neighborhoods found it harder and harder to put food on the plate, as they found public hospitals more and more bereft of medicine, sympathy for the government fell. Those suffering the economic calamity were clear on who they blame. It's not difficult to understand either. If Canada suffered the loss of half of its economy, if maternal mortality doubled in our country, if the average weight of Canadians dropped by 20 or 30 pounds, most Canadians would hold the government of Justin Trudeau to account. So we started to delve deeper and deeper into areas where Chavismo used to reign supreme. Barinas, the state where Chavez was born. 23 de enero, the neighborhood where Chavez used to vote, to cast his ballots on TV at election time. La Vega, Valle, Coche, and Timano, the famous slums of western Caracas. And it became harder and harder for us to find working-class Venezuelans that supported Nicolás Maduro. When there were protests, we sent embassy representatives to both the anti-government and pro-government rallies. By 2017, the anti-government protests were huge, spanning dozens of city blocks, filled with people from every age group, every profession, rich and poor. The pro-government marches were small, stage-managed affairs, held in downtown blocks where tall buildings presented TV cameras from seeing the empty streets just one block away. When we interviewed Venezuelans about what motivated them to march, those supporting the National Assembly would talk of their love of country, of their willingness to risk tear gas to make the country better for their children. I'll never forget one participant in a pro-government march who told me that she participated because the party official managing her government-supplied apartment intimated that she would be evicted if she didn't. It frightened her to appear in public in a red T-shirt, the T-shirt of Chavismo, supporting a president that her fellow citizens increasingly blamed for the spike in infant mortality. But she needed to keep a roof over the heads of our own children. As Canada's criticisms of growing and human rights abuses grew louder and more frequent, many Venezuelans began to thank us for the stand that we were taking. In one visit to the foreign ministry, where all of the diplomatic corps was called to hear Foreign Minister Delcy Rodriguez criticize the diplomatic corps for the international corps that the regime was the international criticism that the regime was beginning to endure. After the meeting, I made my way back to the embassy car, and some of her more junior employees approached me to thank me discreetly for what Canada was saying about human rights in that country. The risk to their careers must have been immense. By the time I left Venezuela in 2017, it was no longer a polarized country. It was increasingly united in the desire for change. This is not a country split between two equal camps of citizens. The division lies between the vast majority of the population and a regime that population rejects. Let us continue to debate how we can support Venezuelans. Let us debate what measures will help them restore their popular sovereignty peacefully and constitutionally. Let us debate which other countries we should align with or not in supporting them. But let us not doubt what Venezuelans want. They are loud, and they are united in their insistence for change. They support their democratically elected leaders in the National Assembly. Stability will only return to Venezuela once it has a government whose legitimacy is accepted by its citizens. We hasten that day, not by second-guessing Venezuelans, but by standing with them. Thank you.
Massicot first.
Thank you, Chair. Merci à vous trois d'être parmi nous ce matin, effectivement. C'est un sujet, évidemment, qui nous touche énormément comme citoyens du monde. Il y a beaucoup de souffrances, il y a beaucoup de conséquences. Et évidemment, c'est très, très grave. Moi, ma question, cependant, c'est on fait quoi à ce point-ci? Peut-être, M. Rowswell, on fait quoi à ce point-ci? Il y a certains, M. Dubé pense qu'on n'a pas eu d'impact important et ça risque de nullifier nos efforts. Et jusqu'à quel point devrions-nous, comme pays, comme Canadiens, aller pour aider plus concrètement le peuple, surtout si Maduro résiste toute participation volontaire. Et quel commentaire avez-vous à faire où on voit les États-Unis, le président Trump, dans un discours il y a 2-3 jours, qui suggère potentiellement une conséquence militaire? Et à quel point ça dépasse nos obligations, notre autorité comme pays, d'intervenir dans un pays et de respecter la souveraineté de ce pays-là.
Très bien, merci beaucoup pour votre question. Je crois que M. Camilleri a établi un agenda très intéressant avec ces 5 points. J'aimerais renforcer quelques-uns et ajouter d'autres. La chose la plus importante, la plus urgente, c'est adresser la manque de nourriture et de médicaments, les besoins humanitaires de la population. Ça, c'est en effet la priorité pour cette fin de semaine avec l'action que mène l'Assemblée nationale. Je crois que le Canada a déjà fait une contribution importante avec une contribution de 53 millions de dollars. Et la coordination de la livraison de cette aide est une urgence extrême. Il se peut qu'on commence à établir un plan international à plus long terme pour s'adresser aux besoins économiques d'un pays qui a tellement perdu dans les dernières années. Et ça pourrait aussi offrir un incitatif envers les dirigeants autour de Maduro de voir qu'il y a vraiment de l'aide sérieuse, pas juste de l'aide humanitaire à l'échelle à court terme, mais aussi un plan pendant quelques années avec des milliards et des milliards de dollars qui sera prêt, qui sera livré à Venezuela pour la reconstruction de son pays. Je crois aussi que c'est important de garder l'unité de l'approche diplomatique. Le groupe de Lima a effectivement établi une position du hémisphère, des pays qui représentent la très grande majorité de la population d'Amérique latine et du reste du hémisphère. Et les autres tentatives, comme celui du groupe de contact, sont les bienvenus, mais seulement s'ils suivent le leadership de la région. Et s'ils se dotent de l'appui de la population du Venezuela. C'est pas très utile d'avoir des négociations si la grande majorité des citoyens dans les rues de Venezuela n'acceptent pas la conclusion de ces négociations. Alors, c'est important que ces négociations gagnent l'appui de la population et la population a été assez claire sur leurs conditions. La menace d'une intervention militaire va à l'encontre d'une transition démocratique. Et je crois que le Canada a bien fait pour écarter cette possibilité et que le groupe de Lima a bien fait pour le renoncer lors de la déclaration à Ottawa le 4 novembre. Une menace d'une intervention militaire non seulement sera une option violente qui résultera dans la perte de vie, mais aussi produira probablement un gouvernement qui manque de légitimité dans le pays. Je crois que le record des transitions de gouvernement accompagnées par une intervention militaire n'est pas très positif à l'échelle internationale. Mais il y a même une autre raison à court terme pour laquelle ces menaces d'intervention militaire sont négatives, c'est que il y aura une transition de pouvoir seulement s'il y a une division parmi les autres dirigeants autour de Maduro. Mais la meilleure chose de renforcer leur unité et leur solidarité, c'est en faisant face à la possibilité d'une intervention militaire. Alors, il se peut que ces déclarations par le président Trump aident Nicolas Maduro à rester au pouvoir. Alors, c'est important pour nous de continuer d'écarter et peut-être même de dénoncer cette option pour essayer de l'enlever de la table.
Thank you. Senator Coyle.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our presenters this morning. I have three questions, and I really appreciated your impassioned presentation. I know this situation must be very painful for you to be watching, but also I can feel some hope there, Ambassador Rowswell. So my first question is also about aid, and in particular, Canada's, if either of you know, Canada's plans beyond this immediate moment for aid, both in terms of that large refugee population outside of Venezuela, and then once hopefully this blockade is broken, then whether there is a solid plan for both the humanitarian as well as the reconstruction and development. So I'd like to know about that. And I can well imagine, Mr. Camilleri, that it's not just a Trojan horse that they're afraid of, but also reputationally. Venezuela, to its neighbors, to its poor neighbors, has been such a wealthy benefactor, in terms of what they've done with the Petrocaribe supports and that sort of thing. So the first question is about aid. I'll just ask the next two in sequence, so to give you a chance. The second is, of course, everybody is worried about loss of life and violence. Everybody wants a peaceful transition of power if that can happen. We already know that even though it's not shooting, well, there's some shooting in the streets, but it isn't the kind of shooting in the streets violence, but there's been violence. Starving people is violent. People having to leave their homes, people not having access to a livelihood, not having access to health care. Poverty is a form of violence already. So I'm sure there is some talk about, the lesser of all these evils. How long do we perpetuate this situation, which is causing so much suffering? So I'm curious how, where that conversation is on that, those points of, how far do you go? How long do you tolerate the kinds of suffering? And then how are we trying to work with the folks to ensure a peaceful transition, and obviously some kind of an escape valve for Maduro, right? There's got to be, and I know there's probably diplomatic things you cannot say, because that backdoor escape valve for Maduro out of the country to somewhere else so that this can happen. I'd like to hear about that. And then finally, this is not just about Venezuela. This point, Mr. Rowswell, that you mentioned about our Canadian approach, and I know our chair knows I have a question about this, where sovereignty rests with the citizens as opposed to the government, and that you're following the lead of the citizens, and that we are doing it in consort with the priorities of those in the region. I'm a supporter of that, but in this case, in the case of Venezuela, you have somebody who's elected to the National Assembly. So you have potentially and a legitimate other leader, a popular leader of the people that is getting support, and you've done your polls, etc. In other places in the region, such as Haiti, where you see popular uprisings, some of which are linked actually to the money that came from Venezuela to the country, but not exclusively, where we don't necessarily have that clear, legitimate other leader in place, or what is the approach? So I see this applying very nicely, actually, to the Venezuelan situation. How do we carry this out into other environments? And I'm not asking you to speak specifically to Haiti.
Thank you, Senator Coyle. I have a list of
done.
questions.
That's it, I'm
We have other questioners, so I'm mindful of the time. So
Okay.
I'm not sure. You've asked a lot of very valid questions. That we have two responders, so we'll start with.
They don't have to both respond to all the
No,
questions.
but also we always encourage reflections after, and if you can give them to us in writing, we very much appreciate it. But through all that very valid scenario that Senator Coyle has put out, Rowswell, I will turn to you first,
Okay.
and then I will turn to Mr. Camilleri.
Thank you. Let me address those in reverse order, if I may, on the applicability of this, what I'm describing as this Canadian approach to supporting popular sovereignty. I believe it is applicable to other countries in the region and internationally, because in saying that we believe in popular sovereignty, we do believe that the citizens of that country should be sovereign. So that rules out military intervention, which is a violation of popular sovereignty. And then within that, it's not that it's the citizens against the government, it's that the government is accountable to the citizens. There are a few things that make the Venezuelan situation quite unique in the clarity of the situation, with the majority of the citizens very clearly rejecting the authority of the government. There has been a departure from the constitutional order, a coup d'etat essentially from the summer of 2017, when Nicolas Maduro imposed a body that was on top of all of the rest of the democratically elected bodies of the Constitution. There was a plebiscite organized that year where 7 million citizens came to polling stations run by the National Assembly to explicitly reject that, and a population of 35 million. That was an absolutely massive demonstration of support, and there is that unity among the population. And so with those three factors in place, it is possible to say that there is clear leadership from the people of Venezuela through their elected representatives that we can then clearly follow. I don't know very much about Haiti. But I do think we should place emphasis on the legitimacy of democratically elected actors and on the clarity and the constitutionality of the action that they propose. On violence, the principal source of violence, of course, in Venezuela is criminal. This is Caracas is either the first, second, or third most dangerous city in the world, depending on which year and how you measure it, with a murder rate that's something like 40 or 50 times what it is in most major Canadian cities. There is some political violence. Kind of striking that there isn't more political violence given the high levels of criminal violence and the amount of guns in that society. In the period that I was there, there was violence during protests. We tried to ascertain the source of the violence as much as possible, and in general, what we found was that somewhere between 60 and 70% of the deaths during those protests were caused by an excessive use of force by security forces against participants in the marches. There were a small number of cases in which protesters themselves responded to tear gas attacks or to other attacks violently. And so neither side was completely free of blame, but the vast majority of the violence was being committed by those who had the mandate to prevent violence from happening in the first place. And there are certain things that the security forces could do to prevent that from happening in the future. Their rules of engagement are far below international standards for when a soldier is allowed to open fire on a protester. There's quite well-established international regulations, and the Venezuelan armed forces do not follow those rules of engagement. I do believe that there should be some kind of mechanisms between the security forces and the National Assembly to try and build confidence and try to establish in advance what protocols might exist if there's an outbreak of violence, and that would be a useful topic for negotiations. And finally, on aid, just very quickly, I am not an economist. I do remember hearing at the time that I was in Venezuela that estimates about the size of a reconstruction package for Venezuela would probably be in excess of $30 billion. And so putting that size of an aid package together would require pretty extensive negotiations. And one principal obstacle up until now is that the Maduro government rejects the legitimacy of the international institutions that tend to organize those kinds of aid packages, favoring instead bilateral deals with Russia and China, which actually impose far harsher conditions on loans, and yet it's prevented a starting point to the negotiations of how you organize a $30 billion aid package.
And less than 10 minutes, so I have Senator Beam, Senator Dean, Senator St. Germain, and Senator Housakos. So I'll start with Senator Beam.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll be pretty quick. Ben Rowswell, I've known you a long time. Your service in Venezuela is a great credit to your country, and I just wanted to put that on the record. I have three quick points. Let us look at a post or a transition scenario. Guaido is the interim president. He's charged under the Constitution with, in fact, ensuring that elections take place. Is there a role here for a regional organization such as the OAS? The OAS has been debating and Venezuela for many years. Certainly, when I was there 2 decades ago, it was a big theme. Is there a role, or has the OAS marginalized itself because of internal divisions, whether it's the Caribbean states who rely on the Petrocaribe program or others? So that's one. The second is the other sort of pro-Maduro actors, and here I'm thinking particularly of Cuba and Russia. Will they have a role to play in a transition type scenario, or are they going to resist to the bitter end, as it's often said? And my third point, and that perhaps is more for you, Mr. Camilleri, and I admire the work that the Inter-American Dialogue does. There has been an exodus of Venezuelans for decades now, and the richer Venezuelans left, and most of them went to the United States, and they're in Miami and in other large cities. Are they a significant group in a sort of a transition scenario, or are they exerting pressure, shall we say, the way the Cuban community has in Miami over the decades? Thank you, Chair.
lot again, so
Yes.
we were mindful of the time. I'll turn to you quickly to Mr. Rowswell.
Yes,
to
thank you
start.
very much, Senator Beam. The role for the OAS is inescapable, in my opinion, because of the various regional groupings of countries in Latin America. There's only one that has the depth of technical expertise. When you're actually engaging in a democratic transition, in international observation missions, in reconstruction programs, there is expertise in the UN and there's expertise in the OAS. There's no expertise in UNASUR or even the Lima Group, which is just a coordinating mechanism between foreign ministries. And so once there is a clear path forward and once there is a degree of regional consensus beyond the Lima Group, then I think the OAS will have to be the actor that will actually implement the vision. It doesn't seem to be able, given the divisions that you mentioned, to be able to generate the common vision. But once that vision is accomplished elsewhere, they should be the ones that execute and implement. On Cuba, I'm not a Cuba expert by any means, but from certainly exposure to many, many debates about the role that Cuba played in Venezuela, it does appear that the two governments see themselves as a survival mechanism. The survival of one is directly linked to the survival of the others. It seems to me that it might be useful for other countries in the region, Canada certainly, and if we could convince the United States as well, to provide reassurances to the Cuban government that what's happening in Venezuela won't happen in Cuba. The 3-point approach that I laid out, for example, I think would apply when applied to Cuba would not lead Canada down any kind of approach of trying to seek political change in Cuba because of the absence of a wide mass movement of Cuban citizens that are calling for political change. If we were to follow the Cubans, then we won't be pursuing any kind of political change. So any reassurances that could be provided to the Cubans might help them in listening to the voices of Venezuelans instead of backing Nicolas.
Presentations, and Mr. Camilleri, thank you for sharing your 5 recommendations to us, which I think are really, really thoughtful. My question is to Mr. Rowswell. I want to look back. We spent a lot of time looking forward. Are there notable precedents for the approach that Canada's taking here? I'm comfortable with it. I'm just asking, have we done this before in this fashion? Is there anything unusual about Canada's approach in this case? You've noted the recourse to the notion of popular sovereignty. And to what extent, as the country does this, are we resting on the argument that we're supporting a regionally led initiative? So is there anything, bottom line, is there anything unusual about Canada's approach to this Venezuelan situation right now? And are we resting at all on anything that we've done in the past in similar situations?
À celle des collègues. Tous les deux, vous avez beaucoup insisté dans la gestion de crise sur l'importance du multilatéral, surtout le groupe de Lima. On n'a pas fait référence au fait que le Mexique et l'Uruguay ont opté conjointement pour la neutralité, garder les contacts avec les deux parties en l'occurrence, et le Mexique, entre autres, n'a pas rompu ses relations diplomatiques. Compte tenu des relations et de l'influence du Mexique sur les États-Unis et de cette neutralité qui a été conservée par les deux pays, est-ce que vous voyez pour eux un rôle important dans cette sortie de crise? C'est ma question.
Thank you. Senator Sarkos.
Thank you. My question has to do with what are the chances or probabilities of Venezuela falling into a civil war? We see that Maduro has a clear grasp for the time being on the military, and for us from a distance it's pretty hard to gauge what support he has in terms of the public, but he seems to have some when we listen to some of the news outlets. So is that polarization serious enough where there might be even a remote chance of the country falling into a civil war?
Thank you. Mr. Rowswell.
I'll be brief. Again, I'll do it in reverse order. I believe there's very little chance of a civil war. A civil war requires two armed groups. There's all of the arms are on one side of this conflict, and the National Assembly has been, I think, admirably consistent in advocating for peaceful approaches. There's no call to arms. There's no attempt to build a militia. There's no fissures as well within the armed forces. And so specters of a civil war are greatly overblown, and I believe they're actually used by the Maduro government as a way of trying to change the political dynamic. So I believe that we can rest assured that that's unlikely. There is some chance of political violence, but nothing on the scale that could be called a political violence, a civil war. The violence that we need to worry about is the deaths of tens of thousands of Venezuelans and the economic situation that's been imposed on them. To Senator St. Germain's question on the Mexican role, Mexico is an incredibly influential country in the region and a close partner of Canada, so we should always welcome their role. They're going to be an essential part of any resolution of a crisis of this magnitude in our shared hemisphere. And so we should respect their position and we should pay close attention to it. I don't believe that neutrality is an accurate way of describing a situation when you've got the vast majority of a population demanding political change. It's not a question of two different political factions. It's whether we are listening, si nous sommes à l'écoute de la population. Je crois que le Canada l'est, et dans ce moment, je doute que le Mexique soit vraiment à l'écoute de la population du Venezuela. Ce n'est pas pour leur critiquer, ils ont une différente tradition dans la politique étrangère, et je pense qu'ils peuvent jouer un rôle important, peut-être à convaincre le régime de Maduro d'enfin être eux-mêmes à l'écoute de leur propre population. Mais je doute que le terme neutralité soit le terme indiqué pour cette position. And then finally, on the issue of whether there's anything unusual about Canadian policy, I would say this is a highly unusual situation. It's extremely rare that a country has lost 50% of its economy in the course of 5 years. It's extremely rare that you have tens of thousands of people who are losing their life due to policies imposed by a government, a man-made economic emergency. It's extremely rare to have such a massive set of the population coming together to reject the authority of a population. So, to the extent that the Canadian response might be unusual as well, or the response of the Lima Group in Latin America might be unusual. I think it's in response to an unusual situation. I do think it's very much in the traditions of Canadian foreign policy, all the way back to Pearson, who was an ardent defender of democracy, to the role that we played in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and some of the democratic principles that are at the heart of that. The regional diplomacy that we have played in the transition to democracy in Chile, the transition to democracy in Peru in 2000, and so Canadian policy, the policy approach to Venezuela fits within that tradition, and I should say was recognized as such by my Latin American counterparts. The Peruvian ambassador to Venezuela would often tell me Canada had played such a positive role in their transition to democracy after the dictatorship of Alberto Fujimori, that perhaps it was time for Canada to continue to play that same kind of role in Venezuela that we had played with diplomats such as Senator Beam in 2000. And so I do believe there's a tremendous amount of continuity in what the Trudeau government is attempting to do in Venezuela.